I've got two budget headphones here today, and I'd say that one of them is a good budget headphone, while the other one is an absolute game changer in my opinion. One of these is the Thieaudio Ghost, the other the HarmonicDyne Athena. So come with me now as we try to find out which one of these is absolutely brilliant and which one of these is just solid and good. I'd like to start this review with a huge thanks to Linsol for sending me both of these headphones. Linsol is also a channel sponsor, so thank you to them for sponsoring the channel and helping to make this kind of content possible. But as always is the case, despite the fact that there is any sponsorship involved, despite the fact that they've sent me these units for review, there's absolutely no compulsion for me to say anything in particular about these products. That's actually one of the things that was very important to me in my agreement with Linsol, was that they have absolutely no influence over anything I say on the channel. And so with that said, let's take a look at these two headphones and understand why I think one of them might be a bit overhyped and the other one may be a bit underhyped. And we're going to start off with the Thieaudio Ghost here. This one's been talked about a lot ever since Zeos reviewed it, and it's definitely a really nice headphone. It comes in at $129. It uses a 40mm dynamic driver with an impedance of 60 ohms and sensitivity of just 91 decibels per milliwatt. So the sensitivity on these is actually really low, and that means you're going to need a little bit of power to get the most out of them. This doesn't need a power station like a Sivga might do, but to get to an output level of 110 decibels, which is louder than you should ever listen, but kind of a good benchmark for the maximum power requirements for your amplifier, for those kind of momentary peaks in the dynamic swings of the music. To get to 110 decibels, you're going to need just under 80 milliwatts to drive these. And in comparison to the Athena that I'm going to talk about in a moment, that's massive. As I said, we're not talking Sivga levels here. You're really only going to need an amplifier with a couple of 100 milliwatts on tap to get absolutely everything you could ever want out of these, in terms of power and volume I mean. But it is worth flagging that they might stretch some smartphones and even some lighter weight components. Something like an Eversolo DAC Z6 or DAC Z8 might actually struggle to get the most out of these from a power, sort of a clean power point of view. So do keep that in mind, they're not a particularly sensitive headphone. Other than the specifications, let's talk briefly about the design of these. And what I'll say is that they're a pretty cheap feeling headphone, as they probably should be for $129. We've got a very basic headband with some fairly soft and relatively good padding. I don't find myself getting an uncomfortable head when wearing these, but it doesn't feel particularly premium. It feels like fake leather. The padding just feels basic and normal, nothing special, nothing fancy. You've got very plasticky end caps to the padded section of the headband, and then a very basic sort of stamped and bent metal headband yoke here. There's some nice contouring in it, so it looks pretty, but it feels very basic. The cups are also very, very cheap feeling. They look quite nice. They've got this metal grill here, but then everything else is plastic. And then the pads themselves on the inside are just a cheap feeling kind of velour-y sort of pad. Now, I don't say that they're cheap feeling to say that it's bad in any way, shape or form, but I don't think you're getting an experience that's any better than what you're paying for. It's about what you expect for a $130 headphone. On the bottom of each cup, we've got a 3.5mm socket for the inputs, and that's great. It means you can run a balanced cable if you want to. There's lots of different cables floating around with 3.5mm connectors because it's used on HiFiMan, HarmonicDyne, Thieaudio. Lots of different brands are using that now, and that's great. And while we're speaking about that, let's take a quick look at the cable. The cable for me is a bit of a letdown on this one. I don't really like it. It feels very thin. It's also a flat, if I just unravel it for a second, it's a flat ribbon style cable, and it just doesn't feel nice. It's not bad, it's not horrible. I think it's a step up from some of the horrible old HiFiMan cables that felt like medical tubing, but beyond that, it's not a particularly nice cable to interact with. Sound-wise, it's fine. I didn't feel a need for anything more, but ergonomically, I definitely prefer other cables. So putting that aside for a moment, and coming back to the headphones, the other thing that I wanted to mention is what's inside the pads here. So inside the pads, you can see the driver in there. It's quite an attractive looking driver, not that you can really see it when the pads are on, unless you cut out the foam, and we'll talk about that a bit later. It's an attractive looking setup, but what you'll also notice is that it's also a flat driver mount. There's no angling of the driver of any sort. It's a very basic, very cheap design, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but it's not like you're getting the benefits of angled drivers, extra space in the ear cups. There's really very little damping going on behind the drivers if you open these up. It's a very cheap and basic design. And as I said, that's okay. I just want to put these into context as to what you should expect if you're spending $130 on a pair of Ghosts. Now, the final question, of course, will be how they sound, and we will get to that in a moment. But before we do, I just want to apply some contrast here by showing you the HarmonicDyne Athena. Moving over to the Athena now, and these retail for $179. So we're talking a full $50 more than the Ghost. And for that money, you're getting a much more premium feeling headphone. It still feels like a relatively budget headphone. It's not going to be up there with your premium brands like Focal's top-end units or Meze Elites or Meze 109 Pros. It doesn't have the feeling of build quality that some of those do. But at the same time, it definitely is a step up, in my opinion, from the Ghost. What we're getting here from a technical point of view, though, is a 50mm ceramic composite diaphragm. And what that means is that they're combining metal and ceramic elements to make the diaphragm. Whether or not that actually translates into a better sound, that's yet to be seen. We'll get to that soon. But you've got a larger 50mm dynamic driver compared to 40mm in the Ghost. And these also have completely different impedance and sensitivity characteristics. Those drivers are a 34 ohm driver as opposed to the 60 ohms in the Ghost. Not that that matters too much. They're both relatively easy loads for any sort of device to drive in terms of impedance. But these jump up to 116 decibel sensitivity, and that means you can actually get to 110 decibels with less than a milliwatt. So these are going to be very, very easy to drive. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to sound better, but with those sort of specs, you can expect to be able to plug in the Athena to absolutely any device on the planet and get good sound out of it. And so with all that in mind, let's do a quick tour. I've already told you that these immediately feel better in the hand than the Ghosts do. But specifically, some of the things that lead to that is that we've got the same headband that's been used on models like the HarmonicDyne Zeus, the Poseidon, the Zeus Elite, and that's both good and bad. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of the look of it, but it feels good and it's quite comfortable. Between the two, I think maybe the padding on the Ghost is just a little bit more comfortable, but these do feel a bit more secure on the head because the band itself is a bit wider in terms of sort of from front to back on your head, whereas it's a narrower band on the Ghost, which is a little bit less stable. The padding on here is also a nice soft velour, which I prefer over the very fake feeling fake leather. And then as we come down the headband, we've got more of a kind of machined finished yoke style design here, as opposed to that very simple pressed and bent metal on the Ghosts. You're also getting these lovely, they're calling it glass. I don't know if it's actually glass or perspex, but they say it's glass. So these glass inserts here and also on the front of each headphone. Now, as you can maybe see here, it is a bit of a fingerprint magnet, so that's not great. But if you don't care too much about that, it just makes for a nice looking and feeling headphone. As we get down further into the cups, we've got another plastic cup here, which at least I think it's plastic. It's hard to tell. I'm pretty sure it's a plastic cup, but it does feel of a higher level quality than what you get in the Ghost. There's also some venting all around the sides. These are sort of a semi-open design, but they do isolate fairly well. As we move to the pads, again, we've got a nice soft velour sort of finish, or an Alcantara or a fake Alcantara. And to me, it feels like a slightly better quality material than what you get on the Ghost. These look and feel a bit more plush, a bit more high-end, but it is also worth noting there's a little bit less depth in the headphone pads on the Athena compared to the Ghost. Now, I should mention at this point, you might not be looking at both of these. You might say, I just want an open, or I just want a closed or semi-closed headphone, and there might be no comparison here. So the reason I'm actually sharing the differences between them is just to paint the picture of what you can expect for the extra money in terms of the quality, how premium or not premium a device might feel, and also to contrast the sorts of things that you might want to think about as you're buying your headphones. As we continue on looking at the headphone pads here, these use a combination of a velour outer section that touches the side of the head and the skin, and on the inside there's perforated leather or fake leather. Below these pads, we've got the drivers in there. You can see they're quite a large driver, and you can also probably see that these are now an angled driver as well. And this goes back to what I said before. The design and manufacture of the Ghost is very cheap, very basic. There's a little bit more engineering and design that's gone into the Athenas. And we'll talk about in just a moment whether or not that's made a difference in the sound quality, but it certainly makes them look like a slightly more premium headphone with a slightly more kind of advanced design. With the pads back on there, let's take a look at the bottom of the cups, and again you'll see 3.5mm inserts there, or inputs there. So again, that's fantastic, lots of cable options. But even better than the fact that there's lots of cable options is the fact that the Athena comes with a fantastic cable. This is a lovely feeling cable. It's a beautiful woven design. It's a 3.5mm termination down here, so for those that want balanced connections, you will need a different cable. But this one, if you're not looking for balanced connections, this one is just a lovely ergonomic cable, and there's no need at all to upgrade it unless you specifically want a balanced connection. And so everything so far stacks up to the fact that the Athena is probably the more premium feeling headphone of these two. Looking at the two of them, there looks to be more than $50 value as you look between the two. There's a significant jump in the quality of engineering, the quality of materials, the aesthetics, or in other words, how it looks, but also the physical, tactile nature of interacting with the headphones. The Athena just feels better, and looks better too, in my opinion. But of course, none of that matters if they don't sound good, so let's start talking about the sound. I'm going to start by talking about the Athena because we just finished talking about that with the build quality. And the first thing I'll say is that when I first put these on for a quick listen when they first arrived, I was pretty ho-hum about them. I thought they were okay, but I didn't necessarily love their sound. Now, whether or not there's burn-in at play here, I'm not sure. I will show you on screen here, and I haven't looked at these before I wrote this up, so that's why I'm a bit vague about this. There may be some difference that's actually measurable in terms of burn-in. There might not be. I haven't checked that yet. But there is a chance that these have burnt in and opened up a little bit. In my experience, some headphones do benefit from burn-in in an audible way, others don't, and this might be one of those cases because I went from really thinking the Athenas were just okay to thinking they're absolutely fantastic. What you get when you listen to the Athenas is a sound that's quite crisp and kind of detailed up top, but it's well refined and well controlled. It doesn't get harsh or sibilant or nasty ever. The vocals are forward, and I mean that in a good way. They're present, they're solid, they're really well balanced with the rest of the mix, they're not recessed in any way. And there's a good balance between the body of the vocal, the weight and the sort of presence of the vocal, as well as the texture of the vocal, so air and detail and texture. What you also get with that mid-range is a wonderful sense of detail. When I put these on, I'm aware of details in the mid-range. So whether it's vocals or guitars or other instruments, there's just a wonderful sense of texture and clarity that goes all the way through the mids, not just keeping it up in the treble. And some headphones do have a tendency to bring out all these details in the treble, but don't really come forward in the mid-range in the same way. And that's something I appreciate about the Athenas. As we move down into the bass, I feel like the amount of bass delivered is quite neutral and therefore very natural. There's no sense of enhancement, but it also doesn't taper off too fast. The extension is very good all the way down to the bottom, and that gives the Athenas a great sense of authority and presence in the sound without boosting the bass, without throwing off the tonality too much. And so I do see these as having a very slight tilt towards treble overall, but it's a very balanced tonality overall as well. And so I think their positioning in the marketing as being sort of a neutral studio reference monitoring type headphone is spot on. They're not 100% perfectly natural because they do have that slight treble emphasis, but it's beautifully controlled and very well balanced across the board. Looking now at soundstage, and they do sound like a closed back. They're not going to throw a large, wide open soundstage that's bigger than what's inside your head, but there's a good sense of space and size within that soundstage, even though it is somewhat contained within the head. I'd also say that the imaging, so the focus of the image and the separation of sounds is again very good for the price that you're paying. And that's despite the fact that there's not a lot of space to work with because the soundstage is within the head, as I just said a moment ago, but within that soundstage, they're creating about as much space as you could expect. And so I think all in all, the Athenas stack up as a pretty good option in the closed back market. Their balanced tonality means that they work for really any genre, whether it's rock, pop, blues, jazz, electronic, classical, opera, you name it, it's going to handle that well because of the very balanced tonality. I don't think they specifically excel in any genre because they're so balanced, but that means they can turn their hand to anything and sound pretty good. And so considering them just in isolation, I was pretty impressed with the Athenas by the time I got to the end of this section. And so then I turned my attention over to the Ghost to see how the Ghost compared from a sonic point of view. Once again, what I heard was that quite crisp upper treble, not dissimilar to what I heard from the Athenas. And thankfully, just like with the Athenas, it's controlled in a way that doesn't throw the tonality off too much. It's quite a high treble peak, and that helps to keep it out of the areas of the music that help us to define tonality and timbre of instruments. So instead it brings an extra sense of detail and clarity without throwing off the tonality. Unfortunately, I do find that it can get a little bit spicy on sibilant sounds, so sounds like S and T. I sometimes found that it was just a little bit bitey from the Ghosts, depending on the track I was listening to, the gear I was using, etc. And then as we come down into the mids, there's generally a good sense of tonality from the Ghosts. I do think they lean sometimes just a little bit too far into the upper end of the mid-range and into the treble, the lower treble, and that can mean that there's a bit too much emphasis on things like texture and air sometimes, and that can throw off the sense of naturality a bit. I think a big part of that is that when you do start to emphasize those frequencies, what you also start to hear is that there's not the best refinement levels in the sound from the Ghost. They're not bad. I'm not saying they're trashy by any stretch at all. They're a good sounding budget headphone, but you do start to hear across a wide range of tracks that they do lack that last little bit of refinement that I do always want, even from a budget headphone. Another thing that for me holds the Ghosts back a bit is they've got pretty poor bass extension. They don't go as deep as I would like, and that means that they lack the foundation and the presence to make the whole musical experience come alive. I think that's doubly a problem because they've got this extra treble emphasis up high, and without the bass extension and weight to help balance that, it allows the Ghosts to lean a little bit too far into the treble. They're not bad, they're not harsh, but I think tonally they're just not as natural as I'd like to hear them. And at this point, it's probably worth bringing up what might be the elephant in the room here, and that is that Zeos in his review claimed that these were almost as good as the Meze 109 Pro, and that's the comment I keep seeing and hearing through the YouTube channel. And I can't say that I agree. I think the only thing that these two have in common is that they've got this high treble spike, and that does bring forward a sense of articulation and clarity, but where these fall for me, where these fall way short of the 109 Pros, is in two areas. They haven't got the sense of control and refinement of the sibilance and the treble that the 109s do, and then the roll-off in the bass brings them undone from a tonality point of view if we're comparing them to something that's so well balanced like the 109 Pro. The 109 Pro has excellent bass extension all the way down to 20 Hz and actually kicks up a little bit at the bottom, which helps to balance off the treble. In the case of the Ghosts here, they don't have that. They start to roll off quite early, and then they've still got the treble peak, and so you ultimately end up with kind of a gradual upward slope towards the treble if you were to think about the average of the frequency response. And that's what brings them undone and leaves them tonally feeling a bit unbalanced. Now I'll talk about pad rolling and modifications in just a second, but before we get there, I just want to finish off talking about the Ghosts in the context of a budget headphone. And that's because I think it's really unfair to ever talk about a headphone like this at $130 stacking up against a headphone that's nearly $1,000. So me saying that they're not as good as the 109 Pro isn't to say the Ghosts are bad. I just want to temper expectations of anyone that thinks they can buy these and get the same sound as a nearly $1,000 headphone. Where I do think the Ghosts are strong is that their tonality from the mid-range up is actually very good. I don't think they've got quite the last level of detail, refinement, and resolution that I would want from a higher-end headphone, but for a budget headphone, they're doing quite well. You definitely hear the difference even going from the Ghost to the Athena. You definitely hear the difference in the level of refinement that you're getting from the Athena. The Athena performs, in my opinion, probably a little bit better than its price tag would suggest, whilst the Ghost for me performs at about the level I expect in terms of refinement and detail. Tonality is going to be a personal preference thing, so I don't think that's budget related, but I do think the technicalities absolutely are budget related. While we're speaking about the technicalities, let's quickly talk about the soundstage presentation from the Ghosts. Being an open back, they do sound more open than something like the Athena, but the soundstage doesn't really get bigger. And I know that might sound like a contradiction, but what I mean there is that when you're listening to the Ghosts, you get the sense that there is more space around you. You don't feel quite as closed in, I guess you could say. But the total maximum distance between the various sounds within the soundstage doesn't get wider than the Athena does. And I know that's probably confusing and hard to understand. What I'm trying to say here is that if you have two sounds at the extremities of the left and the right of the soundstage, through both the Ghost and the Athena, they're going to sound like they're just about level with the ears. What you'll get though as you put on the Athena is the sense that that sound is then closed in. So the sounds themselves are here and the boundary is here as well. Whereas it's like when you put on the Ghost, the sounds will still not go any wider than this, but it's like the boundaries somehow are wider. So the sounds don't go wider, but the overall sense of space around you as the listener is wider. Hopefully that starts to explain what I mean. In terms of imaging and separation, I think the Ghost and the Athenas are about on the same level. And that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing for either of them. It's just a good, solid level for a budget headphone. As I said before, neither of these is going to compete with a much higher level headphone, but for what you're paying, I think they're doing a pretty good job. And so the final thing to cover off is the genre versatility of the Ghosts. And for me, they're a headphone that's going to be better suited to certain genres. Anything where you're looking for bass presence, weight, punch, slam, whatever word you want to put to it, the Ghosts are probably going to let you down, at least in their stock form. And for me, that's where I find the Athenas far more enjoyable, despite being a semi-closed or a closed versus an open. I would definitely reach for the Athenas far more often. Even if I could use an open, I don't see any benefits in the Ghost over the Athenas. Other than the price, I guess. And so let's talk briefly about pad rolling and modifications on the Ghost before I wrap things up and give you my final thoughts on both of these, and do stick around for the final conclusions because I've got a really big thing to say. But what I'm going to say before I get there is that I played around with the Meze 109 pads on the Ghosts. I also played around with the pads from the Athena Caspian headphones. They were the only two pads I had here that would directly fit the Ghosts. And I can understand why some people might want to get the Ghost and then do some pad rolling. But I also again want to temper expectations. Pulling out the foam from the pads, which means cutting them out from the pads on the Ghost, or replacing the pads with an open pad like the 109 Pro. What I mean by an open pad is that the padding itself is there, but there's nothing between your ears and the driver, so more of the sound direct off the driver comes through. Doing that can alter the sound and could even improve the sound of the Ghosts, but it's not going to transform them suddenly into a 109 Pro. What I found when I used the 109 Pro pads on the Ghosts was that it did sort of change the sound a little bit. It made them a little bit smoother. It gave a bit more weight to the sound, but I also felt like it robbed them of a little bit of detail and resolution. So it depends on what you're looking for from the Ghost. If you're looking for a detailed sounding headphone, you probably want to stick to the stock pads. You could then, of course, try pulling out the foam and see if that helps to tweak the tonality if you feel it needs it. But I think if you moved over to something like the 109 pads themselves, that's going to change what the Ghosts are giving you, and you need to know what you're in for. If you want a bit more smoothness and you're happy to trade off a little bit of detail or sense of detail for that, then the 109 Pro pads could be a good option. But if you don't want to lose any sense of detail or clarity, then you don't want to go down that path. Likewise, you can go to something like the Athena Caspian pads, which are going to dramatically increase the bass, particularly through the mid-bass region. And those can be fun. They can give a lot of weight and presence and emphasis to the bass within the Ghosts. But again, I don't know if it's necessarily better so much as different. And that brings me back to the idea of tempering your expectations if you buy the Ghost and you think about pad rolling. Pad rolling is never going to change a specific frequency of a headphone to a massive degree. It can help to smooth off the treble, it can help to boost the bass a little bit, but think about it more as doing two specific things. One of them is it's going to change the sense of attack from the headphone. So different materials in pads can change the way the sound reflects or is absorbed within the space around your ears. And what that can mean is it can go from a sharper, more attacking, more detailed sounding sound to something that's a bit smoother, a bit more relaxed sounding in its attack. And so a case in point here is that going from the stock pads to the Meze 109 pads, the Meze 109 pads were absorbing a bit more of the energy and making that slightly smoother but also less detailed sound. So that's one thing that pads will do. The other thing that pads will do is kind of like applying a shelf filter through an EQ. They're not going to target a specific frequency. And what I mean by that is that you can't go out there and buy a pad, at least not one I've ever found. You can't go out there and buy a pad that is just going to target the sub-bass roll-off that for me is where the Ghosts start to fall down in the comparisons to the 109 Pro. You can definitely put on a pad like the Athena Caspian pads, but what that's going to do is take all the frequencies from about, I think it was around about 200 Hertz or so. It's going to take all of those and lift them all. And so what you're going to get is, if you imagine this as the whole frequency response, pads are generally going to just tilt one side up or another side down. So depending on what happens, you might get more bass, you might get a little bit less treble, you might get a little bit more treble, but as you can see, it's targeting big bands of sound, and that's going to change the overall tonality for better and worse sometimes, but it's not going to target specific areas where a headphone might be weak. And that's a long way of saying that, for me, what the Ghosts actually need the most is a lift in the sub-bass. And I don't see any pad, I've never found a pad, that's going to target just those frequencies. That's generally going to come down to the capabilities of the driver. Possibly you could EQ them. I'm not a big EQ user, so I haven't tested that. But the long and the short of it is, I think the Ghosts are a solid budget headphone, and that's where it ends. These are not a giant killer. These are not a replacement for the 109 Pro, and I think anyone convincing themselves of that is probably ultimately either lying to themselves or going to be disappointed. Again, I'm not saying they're a bad headphone. I think they're actually a really lovely budget option headphone. I just don't want you going out there spending $130 thinking that that's all you need to spend to get great sound, and then down the track realizing that now you've spent that $130 there, and now you've got to spend more to get the sound that you were actually after. You'd be better off to save up a bit more to start with and buy a better headphone to start with. Of course, if you only want to spend $130 and you're happy with what I've described about the Ghosts, go for it. They're a good, solid option. But having said that, if you want a really, really what I think is a fantastic option, you should be looking at the Athenas. I have been so impressed by the Athenas, partly because I think they're just a good, solid headphone at the price, but more importantly, this is a closed-back headphone that doesn't sound like a closed-back headphone. Almost every closed-back headphone I've tried at any price level has major compromises in the frequency response. Whether it's from ZMF, HiFiMan, Sennheiser, I can't think of the others that I've tried. Every single closed-back Beyerdynamic is in there as well, Denon's in there as well. Every single closed-back headphone I've tried has significant issues with trying to control resonance and reflections in the cup, and thus resulting in a really lumpy, bumpy, and unnatural sounding frequency response. Not so with the Athena. The Athena has delivered a sound that is very natural, it's very balanced across the board, and resolution and detail are also strong, whilst providing a good sense of separation and imaging within a closed-back headphone. And it's for that reason that I'd say that if you're looking for a great budget headphone, and you don't really care whether it's open or closed because they both kind of sound a bit similar anyway, if you're just looking for a fantastic budget headphone, I think the Athena should shoot right to the top of almost everybody's list. I think it's really that good. Likewise, if you're looking for a great, tonally balanced, closed or semi-closed back headphone, regardless of the price, I haven't heard anything that I think is clearly superior to the Athena from a tonality point of view, below maybe $400 or $500. Even something like the Sundara closed, whilst it may have some technical capabilities that go beyond the Athena, in terms of tonality and naturality, it's not even close. The Athena is absolutely better when it comes to the tonality. Again, I'm not saying technicalities is better, I'm just talking about tonality. This is an absolute gem of a headphone if you want something reference, reliable, neutral, versatile. The Athena is the real deal. But before I wrap things up there with that bit of a bombshell, let me give you two final comparisons. I thought rather than comparing an open back and a closed back, that wasn't entirely fair. So I looked at my collection and I thought, what else do I have that's similar to the Ghost? If you want open, you don't want closed back, what else could you look at for your money? And one of the options that I had here is the HiFiMan HE400SE. These are both very affordable open back headphones, the HiFiMan being plain and magnetic, the Ghost being a dynamic driver. And so I fired both of them up and I listened to Us and Them by Pink Floyd. At around 2 minutes 26, when the track picks up, the very first thing I noticed was that I was just lacking engagement in the music with the Ghosts. That roll-off in the bass from the Ghosts just left them feeling a bit lifeless, a little bit lacking in body and excitement in the music. Everything sounded nice enough in the top end, but it just didn't bring the whole musical experience together for me. When I moved over to the HE400SE, they're admittedly not particularly bassy either. For me, they lack a little bit of bass presence as well. But what was really clear as I went across to the HiFiMans was that they had much better separation, much better imaging focus, a larger sense of soundstage. Everything about them was doing a better job than the Ghosts for me. As I said, there's still a leaner tonality, that being the HE400SE, but I also think they had just a little bit more sense of body than the Ghost, and that also helped to bring the music more to life through the 400s. I also was aware that the sound was more refined and kind of more liquid as well. And what I mean by liquid in this context is it was smooth, it was easy to listen to, but also still articulate and detailed. And so for me, other than there being a $20 difference between the Ghost and the HE400SE, I really don't see a reason to buy the Ghosts. The HE400SE is just as comfortable, in some ways more comfortable, it probably feels a little bit better made in some ways as well, and I think it provides a better overall sonic experience. Both are a little bit lean, but the HE400SE, if I had the two of them in front of me, the HE400SE is the one I would pick up every single time. I can't think of any reason I would reach for the Ghosts over the HE400SE. And so I'm going to park that one there, and let's now just double check what I was saying before about whether the Athenas are as good as I thought they were. Another closed-back headphone that I really like, that's similar in price to the Athenas, is the Sivga Orioles. I really liked the Orioles when I reviewed them. They're one of my favourite recommended kind of closed-back budget headphones. But coming into this, I was aware that they've got a very distinct tonality all of their own. And so I fired up Fire and Grace by the Hilltop Hoods. That was just one track. I tried more than one track, of course, on all these headphones. But the one I chose to make notes on was Fire and Grace by Hilltop Hoods. And going back and forth between the two, the Athenas make the Orioles sound absolutely wonky. I was actually a little bit embarrassed at how much I'd liked the Orioles before this. And that comes back to what I said before. The Orioles sound great in the context of other closed-back headphones where all of them have slightly funky tonality. Suddenly you bring the Athena into the mix and it just pushes everything else out of the way. In terms of tonality, the tonality from the Athenas is absolutely fantastic. They don't isolate quite as well as some of those others, so if sound isolation is really important, these may not give it to you. But in all other ways, they just smash the competition around the same price point and even a bit higher in terms of delivering a natural and true-to-life sound. In contrast, the Orioles sounded boxy and unrefined. The treble didn't have the same sense of kind of control to it as the Athenas had. And the mid-range was overemphasized in all the wrong places when compared to the Athena. Admittedly, the Orioles do some interesting things. What often happens in closebacks with these kind of wonky tunings with deep troughs or high peaks is that they can do some really interesting things spatially. They can position sounds kind of more separated in the mix and create an interesting way of interacting with the music. And definitely the Orioles were doing that, so both had different presentations which were equally enjoyable, but the tonality just kept holding me back from really enjoying the Orioles when I was coming from the Athenas. And the end result is that because of that balanced tonality, the Athenas consistently sound more coherent. The music all fits together better, whereas I think the Orioles and other headphones with those sort of peaky and trophy tunings in closebacks, they tend to pull apart the music more, which is interesting but less coherent. And so I'm going to double down on what I said before and say that I think the Athenas are absolutely brilliant. These are my go-to closeback recommendation now, anywhere up to about, say, $400 I think. I would choose these over the Sundara closed for sure. Again, I'm not suggesting they're better technically, but tonality-wise, I think they're just brilliant. So unless you need more isolation, or unless you specifically don't want a semi-closed/closed headphone, then I think the Athena should jump all the way to the top of your list and you should grab a pair immediately. They're brilliant. As for the Ghosts, not so much. I think the HE400SE is a better option for just $20 more. Or again, if you don't need an open back specifically, just get yourself a pair of Athenas. So I'm sorry for those of you out there that have the Ghosts, love the Ghosts, etc. They're not a bad headphone at all. They're a lovely, good sounding headphone for the price, but I think there's still better choices out there on the market. And so I'm going to wrap things up there. As always, I hope you found this video useful, helpful, or informative. And if you have, please hit the like button and subscribe and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music. So happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.